You're lying in bed at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning when your phone buzzes. Not your alarm, a news alert. You read the headline once and then you read it again because the first time didn't fully land. And then, before you've made coffee, before you've said a word to anyone, you do the thing you swore you'd stop doing. You open your brokerage app. The number is different. Not rough week difference. Not inflation report came in hot difference. The kind of different where your brain briefly refuses to accept that those digits still belong to you. The 401k you've been building for 11 years. The emergency fund you finally got to 3 months. The index funds running on autopilot since 2019. All of it, technically still there, technically still yours, and yet somehow already feeling like something you might not be able to touch. Here's what nobody explains when they talk about war. They talk about geography. They talk about which alliances activate and which leaders give speeches. They almost never sit down and show you exactly what happens to your savings when the world goes to war. The mechanics, the timeline, the assets that survive and the ones that don't. This is not personalized advice, but these numbers are real. They're historical, and they will permanently change how you think about what your savings actually are and what they're sitting on. Let's start with the one thing that happens in the first 72 hours that almost nobody expects. The market doesn't just fall, it freezes. On September 17, 2001, when U.S. markets reopened after 4 days of closure, the Dow dropped 684 points in a single session. The S&P 500 lost 11.6% in the week that followed. That was one attack on one city. Not a war between nuclear powers, not a conflict disrupting the global shipping lanes that carry 40% of the world's manufactured goods. But the freeze matters more than the fall. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the Moscow exchange closed for 3 weeks. Not slowed down, not circuit breakered, closed. The people who needed their money during those 3 weeks didn't get their money. When it reopened, the ruble had already lost roughly 40% of its value against the dollar in the preceding days, burning through purchasing power that 20 years of ordinary Russian savings had accumulated. That didn't happen because those people made bad investments. It happened because when governments go to war, the financial system stops being a service to its depositors and becomes a tool of the war effort. And this is the part the financial media doesn't explain clearly enough. You probably think of your savings account as your money in a vault somewhere, earning a small amount of interest available whenever you need it. What it actually is, a liability on your bank's balance sheet, functioning inside a network of institutions, regulations, and cross-border flows that governments can and do restrict legally, quickly, and with very little warning when they decide the survival of the state requires it. The mechanism has a name, capital controls, and every major wartime economy in the last 100 years has used them. In 2013, Cyprus, not at war but in financial crisis, imposed withdrawal limits of 300 euros per day. Accounts above 100,000 euros had 47.5% of everything above that threshold simply taken, legally, overnight, as part of a bank bailout. People woke up with less money than they went to sleep with. The government called it a haircut. The people who received it did not call it that. Now imagine that mechanism deployed not in a small island economy during a banking crisis, but across a major financial system during an active large-scale conflict. The template exists. It has been used. It will be used again. In France during the Second World War, savings in French banks lost 30 to 40% of their real value between 1939 and 1944, not through dramatic crashes, through government-directed inflation that quietly taxed every account, every month, without requiring a single forced withdrawal. The balance stayed the same. The purchasing power left. In the United States during the same war, the government didn't free the accounts. They did something more elegant. They made inflation the funding mechanism. Between 1941 and 1946, consumer prices rose approximately 20%. The war bonds they encouraged citizens to buy yielded around 2 to 3%. Your savings were funding the war effort at a real return of negative 15. Most people never realized it because the numbers in their accounts looked stable. The purchasing power was the thing that vanished. This is the hidden taxation of wartime. Your balance can stay exactly the same while everything it's supposed to buy becomes quietly unreachable. And it is completely legal. It requires no announcement, no confiscation, just a sustained engineered inflation that every wartime government in history has used to pay for what bullets and ships actually cost. Here's where it gets specific. The IMF has studied 41 major conflicts since 1960 and their effect on participating economies. The findings are not ambiguous. Countries directly involved in major conflicts experience average inflation 17% above their pre-war baseline, average currency depreciation of 32% within the first 18 months, average stock market drawdowns of 28% in the first 6 months, with recovery timelines measured not in months but in years. On a retirement account of $200,000, a 28% drawdown is $56,000. That is not a temporary paper loss you wait out. In the timeline of a major conflict, waited out might mean waiting a decade. The Vietnam War era is the only modern American reference point. Between 1966 and 1982, the real inflation-adjusted return of the S&P 500 was essentially zero. 16 years of contributing to a retirement account and ending up where you started, in real terms, because inflation consumed every nominal gain the market produced. Your balance grew, your purchasing power didn't. Nobody mailed you a letter about it. Here's what all of that actually feels like. It feels like looking at your 401k statement and seeing a number that still sounds reasonable, but being unable to buy the same groceries, the same gas, the same medical care with what it's worth. It feels like the money is there and not there simultaneously. It feels like a version of the parking lot math, checking whether the number is enough, except the answer keeps changing not because your account changed, but because what money buys keeps shrinking. It feels like being stolen from by a process that has no name and leaves no fingerprints. Now, here's the part that changes what you should actually do with this information. Not everything falls. Some things surge. And this pattern is not random. It's documented across every major conflict in the modern financial record. In every major wartime period studied, gold maintained or increased its real purchasing power. Between 1971 and 1980, the decade most shaped by Vietnam-era spending, inflation, and the abandonment of the gold standard, gold increased roughly 24-fold in nominal terms. In every major conflict, the currencies of non-participating stable economies became global safe havens, strengthening while others collapsed. In every major conflict, commodities tied to supply chains that war disrupts, energy, agricultural goods, industrial metals, increased in price dramatically, not because of speculation, because the physical goods became genuinely scarcer, and no financial instrument could conjure more of them. The people who came through wartime financial periods intact were not the wealthy ones with sophisticated strategies. They were the ordinary income people who had read the history, who held some portion of their savings and assets that governments couldn't inflate away, who were not entirely dependent on a single currency stability for their financial survival. Here's the structural problem for most people. The average U.S. household holds approximately 65 to 70% of their net worth in three things: their home, their 401k, and their bank account. All three are denominated in U.S. dollars. All three are subject to U.S. capital controls, U.S. inflation policy, and U.S. financial system stability. That is not diversification. That is extreme concentration inside a single country's financial architecture, an architecture that has never been stress tested against a conflict on the scale that the phrase World War III implies. This isn't a recommendation to panic or to make dramatic portfolio changes based on headlines. It is the observation that a financial plan with no scenario for geopolitical disruption isn't a complete financial plan, the same way a budget with no emergency fund isn't a complete budget. So here's a specific thing to do tonight. Open your brokerage account. Look at your total holdings. Ask one question. What percentage of this is held entirely within a single country's financial system? If the answer is above 80%, you have concentration risk that most domestic fund salespeople have no incentive to disclose. Research I-bonds. Look at international index funds, the kind that hold assets across multiple economies and currencies.
Understand what a small allocation to gold or a gold ETF would actually represent as a percentage of your portfolio. None of these are exotic. None require a financial advisor with a private office. They are just the structural question. If the assumptions underlying this plan changed overnight, which part of it still holds? Your savings are years of your life converted into a number. The number lives inside a system built on assumptions, stable currency, open markets, functioning institutions, the freedom to access your own money. Those assumptions have been interrupted before, in countries that also assumed they were permanent. The question is not whether you should fear war. The question is whether the structure you've built treats peace as a guarantee rather than a condition. It treated it that way last time, too.